So good afternoon and welcome to ScholarSip. I'm Danuta Yatesky, Dean of Libraries, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's ScholarSip session. We are recording this session, and as with our other ScholarSip events, we will post the recording on the library's YouTube channel. So I ask everyone in the audience to please stay muted throughout the presentation, but we will have time at the end for questions and comments. So as you know by now, many of you who've come to our sessions, this year marks the 10th anniversary of ScholarSip. We started this series in March 2012 as part of the library's goal to help build our cross-campus intellectual community and to share a toast to the end of the academic term. And so we're delighted to continue that tradition today. In fact, to celebrate 10 years, instead of hosting 3 events this year, which was our normal number, we made the bold decision to host 10 food for thought sessions running through the end of June. And she edited this out of my comments, but we have Stacy Stanislav, our library's communications and event manager, to thank for that brilliant thought she said one time. And I said, that's a lot. She said, well, we could do this. So here we are. And we are indeed going to have 10 events for this special year. I'm not so sure she's going to be as interested to continue it every year, but who knows? So today's ScholarSip marks our 7th event with 3 more to go. So I hope you will join us for the last 3 sessions as well for this special year. And I think you'll put in chat a link so you can check out the details of dates and times. So now I'm very pleased to give a brief introduction to today's ScholarSip speaker, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, Brian Daly. So Professor Daly is a psychiatrist, more specifically, a clinical child and adolescent psychologist. Sorry, but when I tried to say that, when I stopped, I said, you're not a clinical child. So it's an adjective for all this. But in more specialized, he specializes in the development and evaluation of evidence-based psychosocial evaluations for youth, delivery of mental health promotion in schools, assessment and treatment of children with a chronic illness, and evaluation of adolescent health risk behaviors. His research interests include prevention and resilience in urban youth, school mental health promotion, pediatric psychology and neuropsychology, and clinical and health psychology. One of his current research projects involves the delivery and evaluation of evidence-based prevention programs for kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade children in a school-based setting. The goals of this study are to promote positive teaching behavior management techniques and social competence for at-risk young children attending inner-city elementary schools. Professor Daly is also the principal investigator for Drexel's Pediatric and Child Adolescent Psychology Lab. Daly and his lab team make a difference by engaging in clinical research that supports those youths most in need, but least likely to receive evidence-based behavioral health services. They study and provide services to underserved children in the community setting, where they spend most of their waking hours, the classroom. The team is committed to making a difference in the lives of youth by designing and delivering interventions that enhance social skills and behavioral competencies to promote positive development outcomes and healthy adjustments. And this is, again, a great example of one of our faculty involved in interdisciplinary research, and as illustrated by the many different perspectives of our audience who've come to partake in our conversation today. So before I turn the Zoom controls over to Professor Daly, let us continue our ScholarSip tradition and raising a virtual toast. I think we've just made it past midterms, so make those final couple of weeks before you're running the rat race for finals. Hear, hear. All right, thank you again so much for joining us today. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Danuta, for the nice introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm just see if I can connect the dots. The interdisciplinary nature is actually really important to me, and I like hearing that there's a school psychologist and a teacher on here. I like that Brenna McBride is on here because she's been very helpful in helping me get money to support a lot of these efforts. I'm pleased that one of my colleagues from psychology is on here. Gordon, who I know for a long time, is in physics. I'm not sure how he can help me, but I'm certain there's some way physics can help me understand how to do interventions with kids from school mental health. So let me start. I have some slides, and I have probably put together too many slides. which I regret a little bit because I know when I go to talks and somebody has too many slides and not enough time for questions, I get very frustrated. So I'm going to probably talk a little bit too fast through some of these slides because I do want to save as much time as possible for discussion. So let me just begin some of the sharing here. So the umbrella for this talk today is really school-based prevention and intervention programs. And I'm going to talk about two programs, one that we've done that's a true prevention intervention program, and one that looks at relational aggression in the school setting. And that is more of an evaluation study, but I think they have some nice overlap, but some distinctness to them as well. So the first one I'm going to talk about is some of the work that I do with my graduate students in schools. And as mentioned before, Brenna actually helped me secure some funding from both Pew and the Kellogg Foundation to be able to deliver these universal social emotional learning programs in Philadelphia public schools. We're currently in Southwest Philly and North Philadelphia public schools, although we have in the past also been in West Philadelphia as well. So I want to lay out the story for what I'm going to talk about, and that is these early intervention programs that we do. And the idea behind it is if you can catch these problems early, foster some of those foundational skills, you have the chance to prevent, right, these big problems from becoming problems in the first place, or certainly from them becoming big, at which point, as kids go along in life, when they've got those big problems, they're just harder to remediate. You can intervene, you can improve, but they get bigger, they're a little bit more difficult. And I think I have a colleague from public health on here who knows, again, when you do these universal prevention intervention strategies, you reach a much larger audience. The second one is pro-social peers, for my money, are really the best role models for kids. We come in and do these programs, and I'll talk about it as adults at the front of the room that do a lot of fun activities with the kids. But I've always felt that while it's important, it's necessary to have the adults at the front of the room, it's not really sufficient. It's the pro-social peers that are actually going to be the best instructors of helping kids who are a little bit less socially competent to do better. Following the medicine model, see one, do one, teach one, and I know we have a teacher on here, I've often also felt that sometimes so much gets dumped on teachers. We say, oh, here's this great program. We'll teach you a little bit, just go do it. But we don't really show them how to do it. We don't really demonstrate it for them. And then we just expect that they're going to deliver it with fidelity. And of course, given all their other responsibilities, it's really difficult. Then something that I think is really universally known with kids, if you want them to do something they may not want to do, you have to motivate them, engage them. That's best done through a series of small rewards. And I'll talk about that. But the other thing is when they're learning these skills, we want it to be fun. So in some ways that they're developing some of these foundational skills, but they don't even know that they're doing it because they're having so much fun. Then some of the question I think, my lab has always struggled with is how do we take these programs and make them scalable, right? So you can deliver a really great program to one classroom, and I think we can feel good about ourselves that those 25 kids have gotten, an evidence-based prevention and intervention program. But the challenges is, when you do or do not have funding, how do you reach a much larger audience? And then it's a question of dosage, which sounds a little bit weird here because it's not medicine, but it is how many sessions do kids need to improve reliably and clinically such that we see change year over year. So just some quick background, and I'm not going to read all of this, but the take-home point from here is students from disadvantaged backgrounds, so particularly minority students, they receive the least amount of evidence-based intervention, but they need it the most, right? So in the schools that we go into in Philadelphia, you have kids who are coming from under-resourced neighborhoods. The schools themselves are under-resourced. There are few available evidence-based behavioral health programs nearby. When they are available, they're incredibly long waiting lists. And then when they finally do get into treatment, they're probably not always getting best practice. And that's a big problem when you hit those barriers because, again, when you don't effectively intervene, you portend really bad proximal and distal outcomes. Kids will drop out, the behavior challenges will go on, they'll struggle in school. Because of some of that, unfortunately, that some of those kids will end up in the juvenile justice population, right? All of which is very preventable if we can get in there early enough, provide the right dosage, and really help these kids develop some of those foundational skills. So there's a pretty strong body of knowledge on social emotional learning programs, which is, when done well, and that's sort of the key here, it does have a lot of these positive benefits. And again, I'm not going to read them all, but it is things that, you know, we want kids to be very successful in, because when they show increases in things like academic performance, positive social behaviors, then again, as you go through their educational career, they tend to persist in school, they end up getting better jobs, they have much more promising economic outcomes. But we also know there's a lot of barriers to delivering some of these programs, right? So if you look at the circle here, let's say you're in a classroom and there's a lot of management challenges, there's a lot of behavior problems. We know in inner city public schools, for example, some crazy number, 70% of teachers, new teachers, don't make it beyond 5 years. So they drop out of the teaching profession, oftentimes due to burnout. In the schools, because they're in under-resourced neighborhoods, and maybe it's an under-resourced school district, there's limited funds for professional development, which means they're going to continue to struggle with some of those management challenges, behavioral problems, and again, end up dropping out. There have been other types of intervention models that have been implemented. So some is by these highly specialized clinical staff, right? So let's say a clinical psychologist comes in, delivers the intervention. Well, that's great, but it's really unsustainable. That's a lot of money. Again, these districts don't really have high levels of funding to be able to support a really high level clinical or specialist staff member to do this. So then the thinking became, well, let's train the teachers, right? The teachers are in the school every day. If we can just get them to deliver the program, we'll be headed in the right direction. The problem is we find a lot of mixed effectiveness. And again, I think teachers delivering it in well-resourced schools, you have better outcomes, but teachers in under-resourced schools, there's so much turnover that essentially you'd have to be going in and just retraining all the time, and you're still going to be getting a lot of turnover, which isn't good for the kids. So something that we've done, which is not a novel model, it's been used in other places, but is find a way to partner with the various enterprises, right? So, you know, we have resources here at Drexel in terms of capital with graduate students and faculty members such as myself. We strongly believe in the partnership model with schools, that we don't come in, deliver an intervention and leave, but that we're collaborative partners with them in delivering it. But also that we have a consultant who's someone who's delivered the program before, that can come in and again, troubleshoot what is going to go wrong in the schools, because if you've ever been in the schools, anything that can go wrong tends to go wrong, including being in the middle of delivering an intervention and the pretzel guy comes in to deliver the pretzels to the students. Well, if you're delivering something on how to develop friendships and the pretzel guy comes in, you want to talk to the pretzel guy a little bit more than that. So announcements happen all the time, fire alarms happen all the time, disruptions are commonplace. So you need someone who's delivered the program before, who can consult and help problem solve some of those. The program that we chose to use is called the Incredible Years Program, and this was developed by a psychologist out in the state of Washington. And it really emphasized skill development for kids in those early years, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. So improving things like social skills, self-regulation, classroom behaviors. And when we picked this program, we decided on it because it had a lot of positive outcomes already, had been used in randomized clinical trials, and it also been used with diverse populations, which when we first started implementing this was not true of many of the social and emotional learning programs. But as mentioned before, we do partner with the schools and the teachers and the kids themselves. So we did take the Incredible Years program, although I would say we've adapted it to ways that fit these schools in Philadelphia. And that can be classroom to classroom, and it can be school to school, because they all deal with a different set of challenges. So for example, in our Southwest Philly school, they have a high portion of English as a second language program. So we've really tried to adjust the content for some of those Spanish speakers to be able to deliver it in a way where the vocabulary is a bit simplified in terms of the English to make sure that they're understanding the concepts too. But for example, in other classrooms, we may meet with the teacher before the start of the school year, and they may say to us, well, academically, they're doing great, but we're finding that they're really struggling to make friendships. So then we'll focus a bit more content on that. So we do consider the teachers to be primary partners, and in fact, they turn out to help us deliver the intervention. So this is just a little bit what it looks like, the dual interventionist approach, where the graduate students are the leaders of the session. We go in for about 18 sessions once a week, starting in about mid-October, going all the way through till May or so. We have review week sessions in there because I think it helps to crystallize the learning. We do a lot of training up front, and we make sure that the teachers and partner staff participate in the delivery of the program. So the scalability, what we've done with that, because Drexel had funding from the Pew Charitable Trust and the Kellogg at a certain time, we help coordinate all of the resources, but we do a lot of ongoing training throughout the year. And we do training for the university students to be interventionists. We've partnered a lot actually with the school psychology program at Temple University to deliver this program. And Temple's done a nice thing, which is turned it into a practicum experience for their students. So they're getting both real world clinical experience, but they're also getting course credit for delivering this. And this just highlights the diversity of the sample of students that we go in and do this preventative intervention with. And I figured it's hard to go through a presentation right now without mentioning what did you do during the time of COVID? Well, we adjusted like everyone else did, right? We got a lot more input from our school partners. We adapted because last year and this year actually, we've been fully virtual in delivering this intervention strategy to kids in a way that obviously pre-pandemic we were in person. And we integrated some new methods about how to deliver something. Danuta was commenting on how much better ScholarSip is in person. And I would say delivering the Incredible Years intervention similarly is just much stronger in person, but you work with what you have at the time. So just a couple lessons learned from doing a remote delivery of an intervention program with first and second graders. Again, a year ago, many of whom we would deliver it into their home setting, but this past year into the classroom, is we looked at a lot of the different barriers that we would encounter, and then just try to think through different strategies to overcome, right? So you can't have some of those individual level interactions like you would in person, where you could tap a kid on the shoulder or you could kneel down at their desk and talk with them. So we moved to a lot of small breakout rooms, which gave the kids, I think, an ability to have deeper conversations with each other. The virtual platform was not very familiar with them. We did a lot of visual aids. So we turned a lot of our lesson content into visual strategies in a way that it was a bit more worksheet-based prior. We used to, or we would worry about some of the ability to provide that immediate praise or recognition for putting a quiet hand up, for having eyes on teacher, for having the feet on the floor, for complimenting a peer, for sharing a crayon with their friend. So we worked with the teachers to find different novel reward systems for this. We ended up on Class Dojo, which is an existing behavioral modification system. And we did find that many of the students that we worked with had a lot of or fewer resources at home. So again, we came up with some different online platforms for completing some of those classroom activities. Just one more comment on this. I mean, this was really, I think, an ongoing approach with the classroom teachers to figure out what was going to work best in terms of the delivery model to the kids. So we did measure this. This is a pre-post study that we do because we've been doing this now for about 10 years in the Philadelphia public schools. So we get some teacher ratings in mid-October prior to starting the program. Then we get some post-intervention scores in May, late May after we complete the program. We look at social skills rating system. We get another teacher social competence scale that measures the social behaviors, pro-social behaviors of the kids. And then we look at things like acceptability and satisfaction. So what you see here for the scores from the 1 rating scale is they go from baseline to post-intervention, just for a little bit improved, but I'll explain that in a second. In the other social competence rating scale, they go from a little improved to somewhat improved. But the teachers do find the program very acceptable, feasible, and in their qualitative comments, very effective. So you would say, well, you've spent this time delivering this intervention, and you're really just seeing on scales a little improvement, or from a little improved to somewhat improved. That's not very profound, and you would be right in saying that. What I will say is that this is sort of the mean average improvement. And what you find, and I've always found this very encouraging, that if you go into a classroom and feeling there's about 25 kids, let's just say, 20 or 21 of those kids are actually doing quite well, meaning when we give these rating scales to the teachers pre-intervention, those kids have pretty good social skills, pretty good pro-social behaviors, and they're pretty much on the developmental trajectory that we want them to be on. But there's about 4 kids in each classroom where if you look at their ratings, they're behind, right? So they're struggling to learn how to make friends or keep friends. They're struggling with some of their behavior in the classroom. They do seem a little bit behind the others. When you pull those scores out, that's where you see the big jumps from pre to post intervention, that those kids actually go to like significantly improve from the beginning to the end, which is really who we want. And I think actually gives a little bit of credence to the universal model of using the peers to deliver some of the, the pro-social content to their other friends, which is they show them how to share with a crayon. They show them how to make friends. They show them how to keep the eyes on the teacher. So again, if you look at mean averages, it's not very significant, but I think if you look at the individual level, the kids we really want to improve, they do very well, which is important. All right, just a little bit of conclusion here, which is early intervention matters because it can help prevent some of these long-term problems from ever coming about. We know that behavioral social issues with kids, we see it really in those early years, kindergarten, first, second grade, right? So it is more rare that you'd see behavioral social problems pop up in 6th or 7th grade that haven't ever been there before. It does happen. But in general, we see this emerging early, which means we need to intervene early. And we do know that those kids who come from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, who've got access to care issues around behavioral and mental health, are at higher risk. So those are the classrooms and the schools that we go into. And we do see with these kids, nice improvements in behavioral skills, social skills, ability to recognize their emotions as well, and that the teachers are a big fan of the program. I think the teachers, they get lots of professional development in academic skills, but they get less about classroom management strategies and how to intervene when kids are really struggling in terms of their behavior and their emotions. So I'll stop there. This is just part 1. Part 2 is going to be about relational aggression, but I didn't want to go all the way and get to the end in case there were any questions or comments here.
I had a question.
Go ahead, Kate.
Do you do any of the parent component of Incredible Years, or is there like a similar supplement that you do, or is this just teacher delivered?
So this is partnership with teacher delivered. So actually, the Incredible Years is 3 components, right? One is pull out, right? They do the small group dinosaurs sort of pull out one. Then there's the second one, which is entirely delivered by the teachers. And then there's a third one, which is parent delivery. What we've actually done is in some ways smushed together the pull out one with the teacher one. And I'll explain that a little bit. So when I first started doing the Incredible Years, we were doing the pull out and the parent. And it was problematic for a couple different reasons. The pull out one, I didn't like because it, to me, increased stigma, right? So we would go into these classrooms and you would say, it was usually teacher nominations, parent, Tyler, John, Ricky, come with us, we're going to go do this program. Well, students in the classroom knew Tyler, John, and Ricky were the kids that probably were a bit hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive, struggled the most in there. And I think we felt like, well, what are we doing here? We're probably just stigmatizing these kids even more because it's clear they're getting pulled out to receive these services. But the other thing that we found is if we brought together a group of 6 kids And again, and these were teacher and parent nominations, so you're predominantly getting 5 boys, maybe 1 girl, is you're also bringing those kids together that struggle the most with behavior and emotion management, right? So it makes sense, pull them out, do the intervention there. What you would find is if 1 or 2 of those kids was having a bad day, they would sort of set off the other kids, right? So, sort of jokingly, although true, we would deliver this session on anger management and it would go great. And then we'd say, okay, time to line up to go back to their class. 1 kid would budge another kid and there'd be like a full-on fight happening right there. And we thought, well, I don't know that we've been very effective in teaching them anger management if this is happening. So this is where it started to occur to me. They need to be with their peers who demonstrate these skills, and the peers need to be part of this process, right? That as group leaders, we're delivering some of the content, but I think it's the pro-social peers that also need to show them what is the right behavior to be demonstrating. So I think the big one is we didn't want to increase stigma. And if you do it as a universal approach to the whole classroom, you don't, right? It's going to everybody, regardless of whether they've, demonstrated problematic behaviors or not. The parent one, we did try, and we very much struggled to get a corpus of parents together to do the program. And that was even with things like, providing babysitting at the school, providing food for them, trying to do it after hours when they might be available to do it. And again, it was for very legitimate reasons. They did have a lot of kids in the house with crazy schedules. They didn't have a great relationship with the school, and us coming in as this outside agency wasn't really going to change their relationship with the school. So I think delivering at the school setting didn't really help. But then if we moved it to Drexel, that became an additional barrier too. So I'd say a regret of mine is we've never been able to figure that out, to deliver it in a way, excuse me, that would enhance parent engagement. So I think it actually is, one of the biggest, if you can effectively intervene with the parents, it just strengthens the program for the kids too.
So I might,
Yeah.
So go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I agree with the positive peer models being a huge benefit of the whole group. I've run those like 5 kid groups where I struggled to find a positive peer model at one point. So thanks for clarifying.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just interject here, if because we may actually, with the timing, we may not have time to have. We might not get to all of your presentation. I see some people already have to leave. So if any of you want to be a little anonymous, raising, you can put it in the chat, and Stacy will pick up, because I think we also have some people signed up, perhaps online. We usually do. But I do have a question that your comments have triggered some thinking, which is not necessarily more about what you're doing, but the impact of it. So there are 2 things here. You are talking about training people in a formal learning environment, the classroom, and yet you're describing some alternatives for your intervention, which go into what in our world, remember, we're looking at the informal learning environment, where you're really pushing a student or a learner to become more self-reliant and take ownership of their learning. So I'm wondering, at what age, because now if we project this to those which all of us are dealing with, a college age student and the graduate student, and even our peer researchers that are learners and administrators and whatever, at what age do you find in how you approach helping people develop whatever the skills, the social, psychological skills or actual content, are they ready to start taking ownership and really being treated more as a self-learner? And then the place where you do it may make a difference, and also how you approach them might make a difference. Have you ever been intrigued to see, well, going beyond the, and I think there would be a big difference between the child and the adolescent even, but there's a smaller difference between the adolescent and the college students, since many of them are still adolescents.
Yeah, it's a good question. It probably actually goes to a bit of the neuroscience research or the brain research. I mean, I think about the frontal lobes and executive function, which, the broad umbrella there is sharpening the abilities around planning, monitoring, initiating, being able to shift, being able to plan and organize, but like I said, sort of monitor your own ability to be self-directed in your learning. If you look at a lot of the studies, the frontal lobes don't really fully crystallize or develop until like 21. So I think sometimes we even feel like college students should have that all down already. And yet, I think if you look at brain development studies, it's still happening at that point. I mean, that being said, there's some college students that clearly they are self-directed learners. They know, they have an ability, I think, to connect to the learning and take it on their own. And Jeanette can maybe jump in here if she wants, maybe not, but I think that's always been the intriguing thing about being a professor and teaching is you see some students that, again, they already just have it, and that feels really great. But part of what we have to do as educators is those who aren't yet, totally connecting some of those dots around self-directed learning, that we're trying to put them in a position to succeed through some of the instruction that we give them, right? Which is why this debate comes about in terms of the quizzes and exams that we give that are focused, I think, probably too often, and I'm guilty of this sometimes, on rote memorization, but we're not always doing the best job of helping them be real critical thinkers, which I think is part of self-directed learning, that you have the, both the engagement, motivation, skill, and competency to, dive deep into the learning experience on your own and not feel like you have to have everything spoon-fed to you too.
So you think if you were to start this with a child, a much younger child, that they would actually be incapable of grasping that, or are there some early sort of prep work or patterns or habits to put in there to be ready, to be accepted early of it?
It's a great question. I mean, I was having this conversation with some colleagues recently, because if you think about the early years of kids, we let them play, and that's a really good thing, right? And part of what's nice about that is they're able to follow their own imagination, follow their own interests. They engage a lot. I mean, maybe we provide some support for them, but they are, when they're playing, probably their own best self-directed learners at that point. And then they get into school and we do something different. And I'm not, I think there maybe is a critique here, but we start to then think about, measurement accountability. How are they doing in reading, math, science, social studies? And we start, I think, too often teaching them to the test, and they lose that, that notion that they had when they were younger, that they can direct some of their own learning. I mean, the Montessori model gets at this a little bit. And I'm, again, I think there's pluses and minuses to both models, but when done well at the college level, but also I think in elementary and middle, is you help students just find the topics that they're really interested in learning. And then you set up the right conditions for them to dig deep into that learning in a way that's not so outcome-based about grades, but it's much more, what did you learn? What did you find interesting about that? What did you not expect? What surprised you? Where do you want to take this learning experience next? How can you connect it to something that you've learned in the past? And again, I think just in some of the constraints that we have in the school day that exists, and the accountability practices that we need to report out on, I do think some of that free learning gets lost.
That's an interesting insight from the brain side of it. Thanks a lot. Maybe there's others, or you might want to go on.
Any other questions? All right, let me jump into this other one, and I'll make sure that I keep it short. So this is about relational aggression. Again, this is a little bit more measurement based, but this is one where, again, if I look at the story for part one, we have a lot of prevention programming that targets aggression, but it really relies on two measurement sources, teachers and peers. But we also know, frankly, that teachers and peers can look at a similar behavior of a student and come away with very different impressions or observations, but we do rely on them to figure out what's happening in the classroom. What we've not always done the best job on is helping to understand a bit more about what are some of those factors where teachers and parents disagree about. In this one, it's relational aggression. This is a little bit too busy of a slide, but mostly what it gets at is in the past, we really just relied entirely on teachers, right? We thought, well, they're the adults, they're going to know which kids are relationally aggressive. What we didn't think about is a lot of that relational aggression happens out on the, on the playground or different places where teachers aren't present. And again, with the advent of social media in the past decade or 2 decades, a lot of it is happening on there where the peers are, but not the teachers. The third part of the story is, we continue to focus, maybe to our detriment in the school setting, on really overt aggression, right? So we've put a premium on that and not looked at much at relational aggression. And we thought, well, that's because overt aggression that we see, one kid hits another kid, one kid pushes another kid, that's clearly going to do a lot more damage in the short and long term. But I'd say in the past decade or so, we've looked at a lot of studies on relational aggression and actually found, both in the short and long term, those who both perpetrate it, who are victims of it, and who witness it, in fact, have equal, if not more, psychologically detrimental outcomes. Because, again, relational aggression can hurt, quote unquote, hurt a lot more than some of the pushing and shoving, because it has a lot of peer elements to it. So just to define it quickly, it's behavior that causes or threatens damages to others' relationships and or their social status, just some examples of it, right? Excluding kids, circulating rumors, some coercion too. So we partnered with, and this comes from the dissertation of one of my doctoral students, Chandler Pui, with some researchers from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia who were doing intervention work around relational aggression in school. And actually what they were finding is they weren't moving the needle as much in terms of their intervention. And they were curious as to why this was happening. And one of the things that we wanted to look at is, are part of these results just explained by discordance between what teachers rate as relationally aggressive and what peers rate as relationally aggressive? So we looked at things like popularity, pro-social behavior, and academic motivation and engagement. I'm not going to get into those factors as much because I'll talk a little bit more about the descriptives that came out of this study. But we got about 178 kids, and there are 11 teachers. There's some of the demographic information. And what we find, on the one hand, you could argue something encouraging is teacher and peers were concordant in their ratings of who they felt to be relationally aggressive about 70% of the time. But that also means about a third of them did not agree on who they found to be relationally aggressive. And this is going to have some implications. You can see the breakdown of the numbers there at the bottom, and I'll explain it here. What we found out from the descriptives is, that's great, you get the 70%, but those 30% that weren't consistently identified, it wasn't a simple profile. They had a much more complex profile in the identification. And students who weren't, who the teachers related as not relationally aggressive also tended to be less popular in the school setting. And again, this just highlights some of the earlier findings that I shared. So 55 students concordantly categorized as not relationally aggressive. That sort of jives with previous research, which is good. But if you look at that lower number, about 10% categorized as relationally aggressive by their peers. So peers were saying, yes, these kids are engaging in a lot of relational aggression in the school setting, but the teachers didn't see it. So what are some of the clinical implications? Well, we still now know that there's some of these really difficult to identify students, and that, when you do the intervention there, I think is going to have some impact on it. But it also means, we were talking earlier about pullout. A lot of the relational aggression intervention studies do still do pullout. And this suggests that there's some kids who maybe should be in that group for the intervention, but they're not being identified, so they're not being included. We did find that academic motivation engagement, if teachers rated this high, it often obscured some of the relational aggression that the other peers saw. So probably something like if a kid was demonstrating relational aggression, but the teacher saw them as very motivated and engaged, they probably were less likely to put them into that category. And But this does suggest that multimodal ratings are really important, that you can't just rely on one group to sort of catch all that need to be caught in terms of relational aggression. And I'll just sum it up with a couple things. Well, what should we look at? I was talking with Danuta about executive functioning, but it did seem in some of our study findings that the kids with higher levels of executive functioning were actually able to escape teacher noticing of their relational aggression. And I think that was because they were able to do it in a much more covert fashion and get away with it, but the peers did see it. And then I would just say future directions, a longitudinal design is really necessary. When we did this, it was just cross-sectional. So you just caught it at a point in time. But I think if you ever really wanted to tease out some of the discordance in these ratings, you would need to look at it over a couple years. I'll just thank the different lab members who do all the hard work in my lab. I really appreciate all their efforts. And then for this one, which was a quick talk, I'll take any questions and comments too, and I'll stop sharing.
In addition to question, comments, just reflections of how it might relate to other areas is definitely welcome. So as we said before, I think there was a comment in chat, and so either as Kathleen either raise their hands or jump in if not, and Stacy will monitor. I think I'm now on two screens here. If Stacy would monitor some of the questions that are coming in, she might be able to pull them into. So you've got one, Kathleen. Maybe identify themselves too.
Yeah, Brian, certainly know who I am. I'm the librarian who works with the psychology department and along with other departments. I'm curious about gender differences in the concordance or disconcordance between what teachers report and what peers report.
It's a great question, Kathleen. And we actually did look at it in the study, and I think you're not going to be so surprised, but females are overrepresented in this. And I think the teachers in particular overrepresent some of the females as relationally aggressive, right? And I think too often to our detriment, the females get noted as like, oh, well, because they're not showing much of the overt aggression. Well, it must be that they're doing a lot of the relational aggression, but the boys are doing it too. The boys just I don't think they're being held to the same standard in terms of the observation of the relational aggression. So what we did see is when the discordance happened, it was a lot because the teachers were thinking it was overrepresentation of the females, but the peers themselves were not seeing the same thing. They found it a much more balanced gender representation.
Okay, that's interesting. So maybe from the teacher's viewpoint, it's a little more boys will be boys, and
yes,
you've got to watch the mean girls.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
But then if you take that one step further, Kathleen, if you just rely then on teacher nominations of relational aggression, you're going to get the group of 6 girls, 1 boy, right? When if you had actually then added in some of the peer nominations around it, I think you get a much more gender balanced group.
Thank you.
There is a question in chat that I can read. And that is, first, excellent and very useful presentation. I was wondering if there are any distracting factors that impede students' self-directed learning. If so, how can educators address them in helping those students to be self-directed learners?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably a complex question because I think it's a multitude of factors that are very individually different for each student or self-directed learner. I mean, I think we do work in a system that is, it's, for lack of a better term, sort of for the masses, right? So we teach to the group, we don't teach to the individual. And I understand, there's many reasons why that is. Some of which, if there's one teacher and there's 25 students, it's incredibly difficult to teach to 25 individual students when you're one teacher trying to manage all that. So there's a lot of regression to the mean, right? You sort of teach to a big group and you just teach to the mean of that group instead of the individual learners. But that does mean we don't often really take the time to learn about what the different interests are of that individual learner, and then maybe provide them with more assignments in that area, right? So instead what we do is we say, here's 25 kids, we're going to give them one assignment, right? And I'm going to have the same grading criteria for all 25 kids, but regardless of whether they like this assignment or not, they're all going to have to do it. A different approach, but again, a much more labor and time intensive approach is, well, what might be 5 different assignments that we could give, and that each of the kids could opt into that different, whatever that different topic is, because if they're able to do that, if we know they're coming into it engaged, you're probably going to get a different product at the end of it. And that product should be a lot better, but the hope is that it also, continues to spur some level of engagement, motivation, which again, that helps foster the self-directed learning in the end.
Thank you, Brian. I think that is a very important solutions that you provided. But one of the things I was also thinking about, sometimes we want them to learn interdisciplinary aspects. I'm talking about even the advanced undergraduate and students, and this in itself could be sometimes could be a factor that they don't pay attention to, because they are not interested in these different subjects. They're only focusing on one subject area, and some projects do require interdisciplinary aspects. So that becomes a challenge for certain students who are not interested in learning about different subjects. Well, it is becoming more critically important now these days.
I'm in a College of Arts and Sciences, so I agree with you, Jay. The exposure to all of it, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't always, we don't always do the best job sometimes as teachers is highlighting how important it is for people to be able to synthesize their learning across a bunch of different subjects, right? So, in our department, we have a graduate PhD program in clinical psychology, and students come in and they specialize in, for example, if they work with me, clinical child, we have neuropsychology, we have forensic psychology, we have health psychology. And I've seen the students come in with this notion that they have to be, so specialized in something that that's going to be the differentiator in their career. And I think what they miss, right, it's sort of looking at the trees but missing the forest, is that if they're able to, to take something from all these different content areas that we teach them and synthesize that learning, that they're actually much more well-rounded and much more, I think, marketable to get different jobs. But we have over-focused on specialization to the exclusion of, I think, the real strengths and generality and really understanding many different subject areas, but finding points of connection too. And I think that, our students are not doing as well as they could because of some of that right. Focus on specialization.
Yeah, and I know we have Dr. Luis Perullo in the audience, who is an engineer, I think, and he taught product design and other than mechanical engineering departments. And if you think from the product design perspectives, I do feel that there are some interdisciplinary projects involved, and a number of, even within engineering, have multidisciplinary interest research areas or design areas. So it's quite critically important now, I think, to address all those issues. What do you think, Lois?
Don't pick on me. You bully. No, of course not. Yeah.
But I think to your point, Jay, solving problems, the hardest problems, like even if you talk about the educational system, I mean, they're deep, they're complex, they're not simple. And if you're really specialized, again, I think you're missing a lot of different avenues about how to understand the best way to solve the problem. You can solve it, but it doesn't mean it's an optimal solution to the complexity of the problem too.
Right.
I think some of what we're we're feeling too is it has a really ramification of what is the nature of different levels of higher education. What are we preparing? Are we preparing people who just know knowledge about a particular field, and that sort of concept of the faculty member tells them and they're the director of what they're going to learn? And or is it these, and it's not just soft skills that when you're talking about, how to get along or how you motivate it, but it's actually learning how to learn and learning how to be inspired to learn, and being able then in the workforce that you could make those connections across a number of different jobs. And what's the number now that's going around that anybody, young generation is going to change your profession probably 7 times or something like, at least your jobs, which means you're going to have to be stepping into a different kind of an environment where learning is going to be important. So this is what I'm just trying to see, how early in preparing learners as educators, but then when you're making the jump to go away from, not just the basics. And so I think we're sort of I think you're calling the social psychological thing. Some people just write that off to that's soft skills, but it isn't. It's fundamental requirements even for being able to learn. So that's sort of where the interesting jump comes in. And I think people get set in a certain way, and I think this is where a really transformation in how we approach teaching, but also more interestingly to me is the learner. What's happening with the learner? What role does the teacher have for that? So
I'll just make one comment, but when Malcolm Gladwell's book came out, The Tipping Point, right? One of the things in there was this 10,000 hours of practice. And that's what separates, somebody who's really quote unquote expert or, achieving that others can't. And I don't think it was his intention for what happened with that, but what a lot of people that read the book took away was, oh, my child should do 10 hours of practice in just one thing. But if you look at folks like Angela Duckworth, I think she speaks and she's a psychologist at Penn, where Tina works at, that one of the compelling things she talks about is sampling should be happening. Sampling should be happening, for kids all the way through college, that you do want to specialize at some point. But I think, as you said, it's not till later on, that you should be doing a lot of this sampling early on and taking different things from all that sampling. And then later on, then you'll know what you're really going to be good at and what you want to put a lot of that hard work into. Then you can start to specialize. We have them specializing way too early, so they're not doing any of the sampling. So they don't know what they don't know, which means they don't know these other things they actually would have really loved or enjoyed or become fascinated with, because they're not allowed to go experience that.
That's right. Some thoughts of the leadership from the research can help shape practitioners to how we start applying it to really look at it. And I think we can do a lot of that here at Drexel, because there's not really I don't think there's a deep understanding of what it means to learn something, let alone how to teach it. We're all sort of in this, but so help us with that. Well, our time is at the 5 o'clock witching hour. Did we have any other comments, Stacy, from the chat or from others coming in?
There was one comment in the chat. A distracting factor may also be the type of goals that they are trying to accomplish, whether they're social goals or academic goals. Pursuit of the social goal may lead to directing their attention to accomplish versus focusing on learning. And that's a public comment, so you can see that if it was a bit long to read.
Well, thank you so much. Let's thank Brian again for taking time to feed us a menu, some interesting, very interesting thoughts from his work and his research, and invite you all to come to the remaining, did I say 3? I think 3 ScholarSip sessions. The last one we will have in person at the study. So I hope you'll come to that one as well. It'll be the final grand finale for our 10th year. So hopefully nothing will change tremendously. We can't do that. So we're being optimistic. So thank you again so much, Brian, for joining us, and for all of you to come as long. Some of us will hang out a little bit if there's interest in sort of an after party here, but otherwise, have a great afternoon, rest of your evening.
Yeah, and I just want to thank
Bye.
you Danuta, for inviting me and for everyone else for attending. I appreciate you taking the time today too.